Hey friends, I am Sharon Betters and you are listening to the Help and Hope podcast produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. And it is such a privilege for me today to introduce to you our guest, Clarissa Moll. Clarissa is a prolific writer and she is a podcaster. In fact, she co-hosted the podcast series Surprised by Grief for Christianity Today. She is a frequent guest on podcasts and radio shows, and you're going to understand why as you listen to our conversation, because she has an incredible story, an incredible redemption story, and she is passionate about sharing the help and hope of Jesus through her story. I met Clarissa through her book, Beyond the Darkness. I cannot encourage you enough to get this book, because if you've been listening to the podcast for very long, you know that we lost our 16-year-old son, Mark, and his friend Kelly in a fatal car accident. And I wish I had had this book back then, because it's like a roadmap through the wilderness of suffering. And I'm so grateful that, Clarissa, you answered the call from the Lord to share your story, and not just once, but over and over again, and that you're going to be sharing with us today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Clarissa, I want to just jump right into your story. If you would just tell us what happened, the sudden loss of your husband, and how that just profoundly changed your life.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my husband, Rob, and I were married for 17 years. We had 4 children and we loved to travel. And in the summer of 2019, we traveled across the country from Boston, our new home, to Seattle, our old home, to visit friends and to see national parks, to go camping. And during that trip, right in smack dab in the middle of the vacation, my husband fell to his death on a hike with a good friend in Mount Rainier National Park. 2 police chaplains arrived at my campsite that night to give me the news that increasingly over the day, when I hadn't heard from him, I was starting to dread. And, if you have lost a loved one, whether it has been sudden or it has been something that you have anticipated, it really doesn't matter. In that moment when the news is final, when the reality sets in, it just bowls you over. And certainly that was our experience. I was left that night wondering how I was going to live without him, how I would parent our 4 children, what I would do, how I would even get home, because we were across the country, far away, and in a place that was familiar, and yet it wasn't where our stuff was, where our home was. And so everything in our life changed after that. And over the last 4 years, it's been a process of figuring out, how do I live again? Do I even want to live again? And what's that going to look like if I pursue wholeness when it feels oftentimes like half of me is missing?
Yeah, I definitely resonate with so much of what you're saying. And I'm imagining you, I think you were about 3,000 miles away from your home. And I'm imagining getting that news, and like the night of Mark's death, immediately there were friends and family that surrounded us. They were right there to help us make decisions and figure out what next steps were. But to be in that place, where did you find help and comfort and direction and help in making decisions?
I was blessed to have friends who were local to us there. And so we were surrounded by a group of people who loved us well, who helped us to make decisions, who helped me to make decisions, who helped to get us back home. We had wonderful and have wonderful family who have supported us entirely through this process. And so we were blessed in that way. And, I don't take that for granted, because in my work in bereavement advocacy, I meet so many folks who haven't experienced that, they have met with their person's death and they have experienced a profound sense of loneliness, that there haven't been supportive people around them, that they have come up against conflict, weddings and funerals, they bring all the yucky stuff up. And many people have experienced that kind of additional sorrow heaped on top of the loss of their loved one. So I count it just an extraordinary gift that we were able to receive that kind of care from folks around us.
Yeah. There's so many things about your story that, for a person of faith, you have to look at it and say, God's hand was in this in so many ways. And one of the ways that just was profound is the way that he actually started preparing you for living life without Rob so many years before. I'd love to share that with our listeners, especially a book that Rob had written and you had edited, and how God used that. And I just get teared up when I think about that incredible God supplying your needs before you even knew that you were going to need it.
Certainly. Yeah. The Lord was abundant in his care in that way. Rob was a journalist, and he had reported on the Terry Schiavo case down in Florida, the Dignity to Die movement. That had been all of what had been going on during his time as a newspaper reporter. And as he reported on these stories and asked questions about euthanasia and what it meant to die well, seeing the government intervene and ethical questions arise, he began to wonder what it meant for Christians to die well in the 21st century. We died very differently, it seemed, from folks that he had studied in the past, who had been surrounded by family and friends, who hadn't had those kind of ethical dilemmas because they didn't have invasive medical procedures, for example, to make things muddy at the end. And so he began to research, as most journalists do. He wanted to find an answer. He had a nose for news, and he began working at a funeral home on the night shift in our local community. He began work as a hospice volunteer, sitting with folks on the weekends, encouraging their families, just sitting and holding hands and talking. And through that experience, he realized that we could recapture a more Christian sense of what it meant to die. It would mean acting differently than a lot of the world did when they came to face their end. It would mean facing and not running away from the reality of our mortality. But it was something that the Bible gave us tools to do. And so he wrote this book, The Art of Dying, Living Fully into the Life to Come, based on those years of research and work. And yeah, death was a common conversation around our kitchen table in our early 30s when we had little kids. And I didn't like it at all. I will fully admit that. It's not the kind of thing a young mom wants to even think about. I would prefer to think about a big, long, glorious future for my family. And I never wanted to imagine that he wouldn't ever be in the picture, that I wouldn't ever be in the picture. But he pressed in to those conversations, and we had them. We had conversations about end of life, what our wishes were, what our will should look like, what kinds of things we wanted at our funerals or at our ends. And so even all those years before, we had begun talking about the things that I would have to enact when I learned that he had died. I will say it didn't make it easier. It didn't make the grief any easier. It certainly made the planning and the logistics, which bogs down a lot of grieving people. It made that part of it much, much easier. I knew what he wanted. I could execute it on it. And it honestly gave me space for the hardest part, which was figuring out how I was going to live without him.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think about all of that. I think about what an incredible man Rob was, because what a journalist to dive deep into what his heart was telling him needed to be shared with others. And that's amazing. It's just amazing too. So that The Art of Dying, the book is called The Art of Dying, and you have added something to the book, haven't you? The book is available. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So after he died, with his publisher, we determined to just complete the circle, as it were. And so I added an afterword that talks about Rob's legacy, about what it means to grieve in light of what he wrote. And it became the basis for what I wrote in my book, Beyond the Darkness.
As I think about you're faced with this horrific loss, and it confronts you with all kinds of other choices. And one of them is, who am I going to be? What am I going to be like 20 years from now, 10 years from now? I remember thinking after Mark's death, I have a choice now. I can become a bitter old woman, or I can find purpose in what God has allowed in my life. And so I know that you've had moments like that too. How did you choose to live with hope rather than with despair?
I think it's a daily process. And even 4 years out, I think there are some days where I still wonder, how am I going to do this? How am I going to am I going to face retirement without you? How am I going to watch my kids walk across the stage at their graduations without you? How am I going to live? And so I wish that there were a sort of easy answer, a sort of biblical pill you could take that would give you hope that would last for eternity. But, if we're given a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, that means we get just enough light for today. We get a new deposit of morning mercies every morning. And so that means we get enough for now. And I found that is what the walk with hope has been for me, that it's hope enough for today. Lord, give me the hope to get through this day. Maybe it's get through this week if it's a tough week. And I'm going to leave the future to you, because one thing that grief and the loss of my husband has shown me is that I don't have control. And, it's easy after we've lost our person to try to want to clutch onto the things that we can control. Well, I'm going to plan the rest of my life really rigidly now, so nothing bad can happen ever again. And that's not even possible. And so I've found that kind of striving is really exhausting. And instead, falling back into the arms of Jesus, letting him carry me each day, waking up and saying, okay, Lord, it's not your strength it's not my strength that's going to get me through today. It's going to be all you. So show up and do your wonderful thing, Lord. That's the kind of posture that I think is required for living with hope beyond that despair.
You mentioned 4 years. It's only been 4 years. That is not very long. It feels like an eternity, but it is not very long. And it's really remarkable to see how you are redeeming the pain, how God is redeeming the pain.
That's right.
Bringing new life out of death. And I can't even imagine the future, as you continue to see the fruit of choosing that pathway toward hope rather than hopelessness. When we lost Mark, I wanted to know everything I could find about grief. And of course, one of the things that I'd heard before is the stages of grief. And so I'd think, okay, which stage am I in right now? But it's like a bouncing ball. I don't know. There's no map that says, okay, this is where you are now. So you found that to be true in your own.
I certainly did.
Journey. Yeah.
Well, and as I'm sure you have experienced too, it can get really discouraging when you feel like you've made some progress and then you have a really tough day and the tough day turns into a couple tough days and maybe a tough week. And you think, oh goodness, it's like I'm sliding down the mountain and I just can't get back my momentum to keep going. And those stages of grief, they can be helpful to some folks, I think, but grief is nonlinear, like you say. We bounce all around. And really, grief is this amazing capacity that God has given us, an emotional capacity to acknowledge what we've lost. We know in the Old Testament that the Lord grieves over Israel when she abandons him. And so we reflect the image of God when we accept that this is a capacity that we have been given, and we ask, Lord, what do you have for me here in this? And so instead of trying to get through it, which the stages of grief kind of want to dump you out on the other side with a little certificate of completion. Instead of doing that, we can just fall back into resting in the Lord and saying, okay, what do you have for me to learn here? What do you have for me to learn about what it means to be deeply connected to others? What do you have for me to learn about my priorities, about my own frailty? Physically, a lot of people who experience loss have a lot of physical difficulties after the loss of their loved one. And those things can make us feel like we're just not progressing. But instead, I think they're just the natural response to losing someone that we love. And the more that we're able to accept that piece of the grief experience, I think the more readily we'll be able to seek after wholeness and comfort in the Lord.
I love the way that you encourage grieving people to recognize the different emotions but then to lean into them to learn about that emotion and what it's telling you about yourself. I hadn't really thought about that before. So for instance, fear. As you said earlier, you can't control anything. I think that's one of the biggest things that hits you is the next phone call, the next knock on the door, what is going to be the next shoe that falls. So you have no control. And so there's fear I didn't want my other children to leave the house.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it could happen again. But you encourage us to look at those emotions very specifically and intentionally. Do that with fear, because I think that's a common one. What can fear teach us? It's almost like you're saying your emotions can be your friends if you take the time to get to know them. How? And how does that work?
Well, we've all been in a classroom as kids or adults. And I'm a teacher, former teacher, and I like to think about my emotions like a classroom. There are some students, in a classroom who are clamoring for attention, and they have the loudest voice in the room. And, as a good teacher, you have to listen to them, but but there are occasions where you have to tell them to be quiet. You've said enough. It's time to sit down. And then there are other students in the classroom who sit quietly in the back, and they have good things to say, but either they never have the courage to speak, they never feel they have the space to speak. There are just too many other factors that keep them quiet. And it's your job as the teacher to kind of tease that out, to say, hey, I noticed that you haven't said anything. I know you have valuable insights. Would you participate in discussion? And when I think about our emotions after loss, I think that's a lot of how it is. For some of us, anger is the loudest voice in our heart's classroom. We're mad at God. We're mad at the medical professionals that weren't able to save our person. We're mad at our person for making choices that led to their death. We're just mad at the world, just a general kind of anger. And it's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel angry at the brokenness of the world. If anger is the only voice that's speaking in your heart's classroom, it crowds out other important voices that also need to give wisdom to you as you journey with loss. And so sometimes it's important to say, okay, anger, it's time to be quiet. I think fear wants to say something. Behind that angry feeling, I think there's a sense of unrootedness, of loss that needs to be acknowledged. And fear gets to talk. Sometimes hope needs to speak, or peace. Sometimes disappointment or frustration or joy, relief even. If you've been a caregiver, you may feel guilty about letting relief speak. But all of those emotions inform how we face our loss, and they acknowledge that we're whole people, that we have a wide range of emotions, and that all of those can be used by the Lord to give us wisdom and insight as we grow more into the people that He calls us to be.
Think about some of the emotions that you might be trying to push back into the background that really do need to speak. And as you examine them, it's almost as though you can say, oh, I get it now. I get what's going on here. And it might help me know how to take the next step. As I think about fear, is to acknowledge that fear is dominant, and how can I let my kids go without being terrorized that something is going to happen. One of the emotions I think that we might deal with, I think a lot of people deal with sudden loss especially, is regrets. Not having the opportunity to say the things that we would have said, or perhaps something we did that we're ashamed of, or that they did that they never reconciled with us over. I know that's a big topic, but even just a minute of how do you work your way through those regrets in a way that brings freedom from the shame or guilt?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that every single person dies with unfinished business. Even in those relationships that are really sweet, there are conversations that you haven't had. I think about my husband and the conversations that he never got to have about things like puberty or dating with our kids. Those are awkward conversations, but they are a sweet part of what it means to be a parent and to parent your children through the adolescence into adulthood. And so I experienced regret that he never got to have those conversations. Now, some folks experience regret because there was tension in their relationship. There was estrangement, there was abuse, and it never was resolved. And those feelings are very real. And so it helps to remember that we all die with unfinished business. I think the second thing that's really helpful for folks is to find some way of expressing those feelings of regret or guilt or shame, whether it's to write it down and share those words with a friend, whether it's to confess your sin to a pastor, to be able to have a spiritual leader in your life where you say, hey, I need to talk to you. I messed up with my relationship with this person and he or she isn't here anymore. But the scripture tells us that we can confess our sins one to another and receive the grace of Christ. So can I just share with you where I sense that I need forgiveness from the Lord? You can do that. And yeah, it doesn't create reconciliation in the way that we experience person-to-person reconciliation with a person who's still alive. But I believe that you can experience peace with God, and that those regrets, that guilt, that shame doesn't need to become a bondage in your life that holds you back from laying that person to rest, laying that relationship to rest, and reforming it into something new as you carry that person forward into the life you live without them.
Clarissa, I like to say that our conversations, I hope they act like salty peanuts so that those listening say, I have to hear more. And friends, I want to tell you that you're just getting a touch of the wisdom and insights that Clarissa has in her book, Beyond the Darkness. It's just a touch of what she has to offer to help you in your own faith walk. So Beyond the Darkness, you can get it anywhere. And again, it'll just take you deeper into some of the topics that we're talking about. And one of them that you deal with beautifully in your book is children, is helping children through their grief and showing us that their grief journey may be and probably is a lot different than an adult grief journey. So what are a few things that you would say, this would be an outline of how I would recommend that you help your child who is grieving the same loss you are, but a little bit differently?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. In fact, so much that I have a book for teens coming out next year as well as a children's book, because children, number one, they just grieve differently than we do. If you have a child in your family or in your sphere of care and they have lost a person, it's not going to look the way that it looks like for you. And I think that's the first thing we just have to acknowledge, that they will run along on their way and go and play, and you will be heartbroken and not able to get out of bed. And you'll wonder, why, are they not acknowledging it? Are they passing it by? Are they stuffing it down? And no, this is just an amazing design of the Lord. That's how he built them, to be able to only take in so much. And really, it's a mercy, because we don't want our children to have to carry adult suffering, adult sorrows. And in the mercy of the Lord, he allows their brains, as they develop, to be able to take in the right amount at the right time. And so that's our job as parents, after we acknowledge that they're going to do this differently. It's to be a good gatekeeper for them. So if you're a grandparent, or if you're a parent, an aunt, a coach, part of your job is to be a gatekeeper for that child, to make sure that they don't get more information than is developmentally appropriate, to talk in real terms about grief and loss, not using phrases like passed away or that daddy went to be with Jesus, unless you also talk about the realities of a body that has shut down, helping them to have concrete language to talk about their loss. And then giving them lots and lots of space to just be kids, because they will carry their loss through the rest of their lives in one way or another. Research tells us that they will, what is called re-grieve. They will grieve again at each new developmental stage. And so their understanding of their loss is going to grow over time. And so let them be children as long as they possibly can.
Speaking of children, you have 4. And how old were they when Rob died?
Let's see. They were, my youngest had just turned 7. I had a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 13-year-old. So they were pretty young.
Wow. That's a lot. But one thing I've noticed, which I appreciate, but hadn't thought about too much before about the implications of it, is you talk about how to help children, but you don't talk about your own children. You're not specific about how you have helped them. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, we're an oversharing culture, because of social media. We're used to having an in on everybody's life, and children are particularly vulnerable after loss. They are subject to cultural expectations, just like we are, of what it means to grieve and what it means to grow. And I want as much as possible to allow them to do that in the safety of our family. And so, I don't talk about them a whole lot. I try to be a good guardian for them, also realizing that at some point in time, they're going to have to own their own story. And we often talk at home about saying something or saying nothing. I've got kids who are in high school now, and some of their friends don't know about their dad dying. And I've told them that's okay. It's okay. I have friends in adulthood that I didn't know they had lost a sibling or a parent until many years into our friendship. And I don't mind, because I've learned that carrying grief is a very sacred task. It's very intimate and personal, and each person needs to do it in the way that feels comfortable for them.
Yeah, I just love that perspective. And I'm looking back and thinking maybe I said too much about our children. Hopefully they're in their 40s and 50s now, so hopefully they've forgiven me. But you're right. Everybody has their own story, and I bet your kids really appreciate that their stories are safe with you. That they don't have to worry about what's mom going to say the next time she's speaking or sharing, or am I going to be embarrassed, or is my friend going to hear about it? So I just love that perspective. I think it's wonderful. You say that grief can become an old familiar friend. But that, if someone is fresh in their grief, that's going to sound like blasphemy. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. So help us understand what you mean by that.
It does sound terrible, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That we'll have to.
I get it, but go ahead.
That we will have to walk with this friend for the rest of our lives. And even the word friend might be just too much to bear. But grief teaches us, if we will let it. If we will let it teach us, it will guide us. God has given us this experience to shape us. And if we don't fight against it, if we're willing to engage with it, I believe that over time we learn so much about who God is and who He has called us to be. The further on that you go from losing your loved one, the years that pass, it's hard. It's even hard for me to say, but it's true that our memories of them grow dimmer, and there's a fading that happens over time. Now, I remember thinking, I never want to forget what it felt like to hold my husband's hand. But now I look at my own hands and I have to really concentrate to try to remember what that felt like. And the reality is that there is going to be some day where I don't remember that anymore. And so grief is not just an expression of our loss, but it also can become a connection of love to the person that we've lost. That in those moments where we feel a twinge, it's just a little reminder, yep, I loved and was loved, and I miss this person, and I'm longing for Jesus to come back. And so if grief does anything for us, I think as it connects us to our person over the years, it just embeds more deeply within us this sense of longing for the world to be made right, for Jesus to come again and to make all things new.
Yeah, it's been 30 years since the death of our son, and the tears spring up immediately. But I've said, grief moved in against my wishes, but joy was tagging along.
That's right.
And slowly joy started pushing grief back into a corner. But grief has never left. And I appreciate what you're saying about it reminds us of the deep love that we have. I don't ever want it to be gone, ever. Because it is a reminder of Mark and the deep love that we have for Mark. I also love your reference to what is to come. Every day after Mark's death, we'd get up and say, "This would be a good day, Jesus."
That's right.
Come back.
That's right. Anytime now, Lord.
Anytime. I'm ready. I'm so ready. And so that's grief teaches us that this is not the redeemed world that God has promised to us. There's something so much better that He has coming for us. And so I really resonate with what you're saying. In fact, my husband said that Mark's death unbolted him from his love affair with this world and the chains, he could feel the chains dropping. And so grief has a way of forcing us, as you said earlier, to think, what are our priorities and how are we going to spend the moments that God has given to us? You made a choice to start sharing the hope that you've experienced very soon after Rob's death. Why did you do that? And what difference has it made for you?
Yeah. Well, I was a writer. And so for me, writing was a way to process my emotions. And because I had connections in the publishing industry and in the writing world, it was a natural space for me to do that. But I tried to be very careful, and I still do, about stewarding the privacy of our story. I will often tell folks that there are parts of my story that you will never know. There are moments of deep darkness that I will never share in public. There are moments that are so sacred that it feels like a moment of stepping into the Holy of Holies, to be able to think about times where God met me when I was so very desperate. And some of those things will always remain private. And I think that that is an important piece of figuring out how to tell your story after your person dies. A lot of us, after we experience the death of a loved one, we just want to tell somebody. We want to tell somebody about their last words or what it felt like to sit in the hospital room beside them. And that's a lot of information. That's a lot of information for others to take in. And we can be heartbroken when there are those around us who really just genuinely can't receive that. And so I think part of our work as grieving people is to learn to curate that story, to know who is a trusted person to share those most intimate thoughts with. And then, without trying to gloss things over or make it lemons into lemonade, share the comfort that we have received through Christ so that it can offer comfort to others. And I think it's different for every person. Some people will share more, some people will share less, but it's not as much about the amount you share as your intentionality behind it and the safeguarding that you keep on the treasure that it is to participate in the loss of someone that you love.
Yeah. And it gives life. As you're offering life, you receive life. It's a pretty remarkable exchange that God gives us the opportunity to experience. So I resonate with that. I had never intended to be writing about Mark's death, but then a friend who was a ministry leader asked me to write about biblical encouragement, just what you had talked about earlier, that some people never experience the kind of encouragement that we experienced. And so I wanted to share that with others. And then God just had a platform, that I knew that this was going to be one of the ways that he redeemed the pain of Mark's death. And I'm grateful for it, for that opportunity and for what it's meant for me personally. Speaking of writing, you mentioned earlier, but I want you to tell us a little bit more about some writing projects. You have some books that are coming out, which sound amazing. Tell us a little about them.
Yeah, I've got a grief handbook for teens coming out in the next year that I've written with my oldest daughter. She's headed to college soon. And so we've written together about our experience as a mom and a daughter going through loss, because there are very few gospel-oriented resources for teenagers. And teenagers are dealing with a lot of sadness right now.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about that. I've got a children's picture book coming out, as well as a devotional for grieving folks. And really, I had one person say, do you ever think that you want to write about something different? And I thought, it's not so bad to be the person who is known as the grief lady, because what a special honor to be given to walk with folks in very difficult seasons of their life, to point them to hope, to remind them that as much as we are heavenly minded, as we long for Jesus' return now, grief makes us also very earthly oriented. We want to make the most of our time now because we've seen how short life can be. To watch folks, to encourage folks as they think through those things, it's a really cool job that I have. And I don't mind talking about grief.
Christine, God has definitely given you a very specific calling, and you have embraced it with joy. And that is such a beautiful thing for me to see personally, to see how God is redeeming your pain by offering to others the light of Jesus in some of the darkest places that a human being can experience. And I appreciate you so much. I hate to wrap up our time together, but again, I want to remind those of you who are listening, the book, Beyond the Darkness. I want to make sure I get the title right. Beyond the Darkness. It is available anywhere, and I strongly recommend that you get it, even if you're not the one who's grieving. There's so much in this book from Christine that will help you walk alongside someone who is hurting. And I'm so grateful for the books that you're coming out with. We have people all the time who, how do they help their children? What is there a book for me, for my teenagers? So thank you for doing that. And I'm grateful to hear you say that you have great joy in doing this. For those who would like to learn more about you, what is the name of your website?
Sure. You can reach me at ClarissaMoll.com. It's Moll like doll, Moll. And I hang out on Instagram and love to connect with folks there as well.
Yes, and it's wonderful to see you on Instagram and at your website. Friends, I'm Sharon Betters, and my guest today on the Help and Hope podcast has been Clarissa Moll, and she, as you can see, has so much to offer us as we walk this pathway. She's calling back to us that God is sovereign and we can trust Him, and yet also acknowledging the reality of those really broken places of life. So I highly recommend that you learn more from Clarissa, that you get her book, that you check out her website, check out her Instagram account. Clarissa, thank you so much for joining us for this Help and Hope podcast. You can learn more about Marking Ministries by going to helpandhopenow.org. You can download our free app. It's Help and Hope, where it will keep you updated on all of our resources, everything new that is coming out. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast, and I look forward to being with you again.